Millionaire decides to volunteer at Thanksgiving dinner at the local community center. When he arrives, he is stunned to see his mother's lost locket in the kitchen. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. James Montgomery was a man shaped by ambition. From an early age, he knew how to climb the ladder of success, driven by a deep-rooted desire to prove himself. Growing up as the youngest in a family of restaurateurs, he watched as his father struggled to make ends meet and learned early on that wealth would be his ticket out of uncertainty. This determination fueled James's rise through the culinary world, eventually building an empire of fine dining establishments known for their exclusivity and unparalleled service. His name became synonymous with sophistication, but the more he achieved, the more isolated he felt. His lifestyle was as refined as his palate. James resided in a penthouse overlooking the city, a fortress of sleek furniture and minimalist decor that spoke to his meticulous nature. His days were a constant whirl of meetings, tastings, and travel, each minute planned to perfection. Despite this carefully curated life, there was a stark loneliness that even the most lavish surroundings couldn't touch. He had no one to share his successes or failures with, only silent nights, broken by the hum of the city below. Friends were business partners, and love was a foreign concept lost in the flurry of contracts and accolades. James's personality was a complex blend of charm and guardedness. To colleagues, he was an authoritative figure with an unerring sense for business and a mind that never rested. He thrived under pressure and knew how to play the role of the polished executive. But beneath that sharp exterior was a man whose heart ached for connection, who longed for the comfort of simple, unspoken bonds, the kind he hadn't known since childhood. He had a tendency to hold people at arm's length, driven by the belief that vulnerability was a weakness that could derail everything he'd worked for. His background was marked by sacrifice. James's mother, an exceptional home cook, was the warm light of his early years, filling their modest kitchen with laughter and recipes passed down for generations. But she passed away when James was still a teenager, and his father, unable to cope with the loss, became consumed by work and distant. The family splintered, and James distanced himself, pouring his grief into building his future. Over time, the once close bonds with his relatives became strained, then faded altogether. Thanksgiving dinners turned into business dinners, and memories were pushed aside for the sake of progress. Yet, despite his considerable fortune, James never found a substitute for the sense of home he'd lost. Holidays in particular sharpened that longing, reminding him of simpler days when his mother's voice filled their tiny dining room and the clinking of glasses meant more than just another business deal. These memories haunted him, becoming more vivid as each holiday season approached. It was Richard Hayes, an old friend from university and the rare soul who knew James before the luxury and acclaim, who sent the invitation that shifted the trajectory of his Thanksgiving. Richard had always been a contrast to James, a boisterous, philanthropic man with an easy smile and an open heart. While James had focused on building his empire, Richard had taken a different path, dedicating his time and resources to community work and outreach programs. He never shied from reminding James of his roots, knowing just when to push him to reflect on what he'd given up for success. When James received the invitation, a simple message requesting his presence at a local Thanksgiving community dinner, he initially scoffed. The idea of mingling with strangers in an old community center seemed laughable. Yet, something in Richard's note made it impossible to refuse. "Come. This isn't a request. You need this, more than you know." The words struck a chord, not because of what they said but because of who had written them. Richard's unwavering belief that James could find fulfillment beyond wealth was both infuriating and compelling. James felt an inexplicable pull, a mixture of loyalty to his friend and a quiet, gnawing question of what he was missing. He couldn't deny that the prospect of spending another sterile evening alone, surrounded by nothing but luxury that meant little, was unappealing. and so, with a sigh and a reluctant nod, he texted Richard back with a single word, "Fine." James stepped through the double doors of the community center, the chill of the November wind giving way to a wave of warmth and the hum of bustling activity. He paused, taking in the scene, tables covered in checkered cloths, children giggling as they ran past with markers and paper turkeys, and an array of banners that read "Give Thanks" strung across the far wall. It was a space filled with life, far removed from the cold precision of his restaurants or the echoing silence of his penthouse. The scent of sage, cinnamon, and roasted vegetables wrapped around him like a welcoming embrace, tugging at memories he'd long buried. James felt a twist in his stomach, a combination of nostalgia and discomfort. Here, amid the chatter and clatter, was a place that radiated warmth without trying, a stark contrast to the meticulously controlled environments he preferred. "James?" Richard's familiar voice cut through the noise, cheerful as ever. He pushed his way through a group of teenagers setting up chairs, his smile broad and disarming. "Glad you made it," Richard said, gripping James's shoulder. The gesture was both casual and reassuring, as though Richard knew exactly how out of place James felt. "Thanks for the invitation," James replied, the words more automatic than genuine. His eyes wandered over the crowd, catching glimpses of older couples laughing, young volunteers busy setting up tables, and a few kids chasing each other with rolls of tape. The scene was chaotic, but brimming with something he couldn't quite name. "Emma, over here," Richard called out, waving over a woman juggling a stack of papers and a phone pressed to her ear. Emma's copper curls bounced as she approached, her eyes sharp with focus, but softening when she spotted James. "Hi, I'm Emma," she said, sliding the phone into her back pocket and offering a hand. "You must be James, our mystery volunteer." Her grip was confident, her smile welcoming. James noted the smudge of flour on her cheek and felt a small smile form before he could stop it. "Guilty as charged," he said, surprised by his own ease. "Well, guilty or not, we're grateful to have you," Emma replied with a wink. "Richard tells me you have experience in the culinary world, so I'm putting you in the kitchen. Don't worry, we won't make you cook for a crowd of 100 on your first day." She gestured toward the door leading to the kitchen, where trays of vegetables and pies sat in various stages of preparation. James nodded, the tension in his chest loosening as he followed her lead. The kitchen was a world of its own, a symphony of chopping, stirring, and laughter. The volunteers inside moved like parts of a well-rehearsed play, trading stories and ingredients with the kind of camaraderie he'd only ever seen among the kitchen staff of his own restaurants, back when they were still small and scrappy, before the weight of success turned everything serious. "James, meet the team," Emma said, her voice cutting through the din. Heads turned, and a chorus of hellos followed. There was an elderly woman whisking eggs, a young man in a university hoodie slicing carrots, and another woman expertly rolling out dough with flour-dusted hands. One of the volunteers, a tall man with dark hair and a grin as wide as the moon, stepped forward. "I'm Daniel, the self-proclaimed king of casseroles around here," he joked, wiping his hands on an apron that read "Kiss the Cook." His eyes sparkled with the kind of joy James hadn't seen in years. "James, sous chef at your service," James responded, a small part of him loosening up under the warmth of the introductions. Daniel clapped him on the back, the gesture easy and familiar. "Good to have you," Daniel said. "We could use an extra set of hands on these sweet potatoes, and if you're feeling brave, maybe even the cranberry sauce. It's got a mind of its own." Emma leaned in with a smirk. "I'm warning you, that sauce has a reputation." James laughed lightly, the sound foreign in his own ears. He glanced around as people resumed their tasks, hands moving with practiced speed, chatter resuming like a river after a brief pause. He took a deep breath and stepped into the rhythm of the room, picking up a knife and finding his place among the sweet potatoes. The hum of the room soon became background music to James. He watched Daniel lead the team with ease, offering tips here, taste tests there, and never missing the opportunity to share a story or crack a joke. It was a different kind of leadership than James was used to, no rigid hierarchies, no glances at the clock, just people working together with a shared purpose that didn't involve profit margins or critics' reviews. Emma, still nearby, turned her attention to him as she organized a stack of mixing bowls. "I know this isn't your typical scene, but you're fitting in just fine," she said, catching his eye. James shifted, feeling a warmth he hadn't anticipated. "It's different, but in a good way," he admitted, almost surprised by his own honesty. The simplicity of peeling sweet potatoes and the playful banter were strange comforts, something grounding in the midst of his otherwise complicated world. Emma nodded, satisfied. "Well, we're glad to have you. And who knows? Maybe you'll learn something that isn't on a 5-star menu." James smiled, the lines around his eyes softening as he looked back at the kitchen full of busy hands and happy faces. Maybe this wasn't just Richard's idea of charity after all. James adjusted his apron, the knot tight against his waist as he worked at the kitchen counter. The warmth of the room buzzed with activity, pans hissing, voices blending with the rhythmic tap of knives against cutting boards. The scene was alive with energy, a world away from the clinical kitchens of his high-end restaurants. Here, flour dusted elbows, laughter mixed with the smell of spices, and the people didn't just cook, they celebrated each moment. "Hey, James, you're up for a quick demo?" Daniel's voice called out, easygoing yet confident. James looked up to find the man's dark eyes catching the kitchen lights, his smile disarming. Daniel stood with an air of effortless command, an apron as mismatched as his humor tied loosely around his waist, declaring him chief of good times. "Demo?" James raised an eyebrow, half amused. "Relax, no pressure. Just need an extra set of eyes on my special mashed sweet potatoes," Daniel said, winking. "It's a recipe with a twist, don't tell the purists." James smirked and joined Daniel at his station. The scent of cinnamon and a hint of citrus wafted up, a surprisingly pleasant combination. As Daniel scooped a spoonful of the orange mash and held it out, James leaned in for a taste. It was unexpected, sweet, with just a touch of nutmeg, and something else that played at the back of his memory. "Orange zest," James said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Daniel's eyes widened in mock shock. "Ding ding. Someone knows their stuff," Daniel teased, bumping his shoulder playfully against James's. "My mom used to sneak that into everything around the holidays. Thought it was her secret ingredient to happiness." A pause followed, just long enough for James to glance at the man in front of him and feel a strange tug at the past. His mother had done the same, adding zest to pies and even stews, claiming it brought a spark to their meager meals. "That's funny," James said slowly, stirring the warm air between them. "My mom did the exact same thing. Said it was the taste of a little extra love." Daniel's laughter rang out, deep and genuine. "Must have been a mom thing. Or maybe our moms swapped tips at some point," he joked, but the comment resonated with James more than he expected. A memory surfaced, small hands holding on to the edge of a counter, his mother's soft humming as she grated orange peels into a bowl, the zest falling like delicate, fragrant snowflakes. For a moment, the kitchen felt quieter. James studied Daniel's face, searching for some answer to the unspoken familiarity that hung between them. They continued their tasks side by side, Daniel rolling out dough for pies and chatting about the time he nearly set fire to the kitchen during his first community dinner. "And Emma? Let's just say she's seen me at my finest and my most foolish," Daniel said, tossing a glance across the room to where Emma was laughing at something a volunteer had said. "But I wouldn't trade it. This place, it's a family." James felt a flicker of envy at Daniel's contentment, the ease with which he spoke about belonging. "Must be nice," he muttered, focusing too hard on a potato he was peeling. The silence between them thickened, but Daniel didn't push. "Family isn't always who you start with. Sometimes it's who you find along the way," Daniel said, as if he knew the weight of what he was saying. James glanced up, their eyes meeting with an understanding that needed no words. The kitchen noise filled the gap, pulling them back into the moment. Volunteers passed by with trays, joking and weaving around each other, the scene lively and chaotic. James watched Daniel with the others, noticing things he hadn't before, a certain tilt of the head when listening, a quick flick of his wrist when rolling dough that seemed eerily familiar. A boyish grin, almost identical to one James had seen in faded photographs from his childhood. Daniel, James started, uncertain how to frame the question forming in his mind. He watched as Daniel expertly folded the pie crust, the motion triggering a burst of recognition. "Where did you grow up?" Daniel glanced at him, one eyebrow raised in surprise. "Moved around a bit, but spent most of my early years in a little town not too far from here. Never really knew my whole story, though. Adopted when I was young." He shrugged, as if this revelation was just another fact, but to James, it felt like a clue, a key suddenly fitting into an old, locked door. "Ever try finding your family?" James asked, the casual tone belied by the hammering in his chest. Daniel's smile faltered, just for a moment, replaced by something more pensive. "Yeah, once or twice. Didn't lead anywhere." "Besides," Daniel said, a glint of mischief returning to his eyes, "who needs that when I've got this chaos?" James forced a laugh, but his mind raced. Memories pieced together in jagged fragments, his father speaking vaguely of a cousin taken in by another family, the holidays spent pretending the past didn't matter. Could Daniel be? "Well, James, enough serious talk. We've got pies to bake and chaos to maintain," Daniel said, patting him on the back and jolting him from his thoughts. "Right," James replied, returning the grin. But even as he moved back to his task, the question echoed in his mind, louder now, refusing to be dismissed. James stood next to Daniel at the crowded kitchen counter, hands busy slicing apples for the next round of pies. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around him, a strange comfort he hadn't felt in years. The steam rising from simmering pots mingled with the tang of cinnamon and cloves, making the air feel heavy and nostalgic. "So, James," Daniel said, his tone light but his eyes watchful. "What got you into cooking? Seems like you know your way around a kitchen better than most volunteers." James paused, fingers hovering over the crisp apple slices. It wasn't a story he shared often, but here, in this kitchen filled with laughter and the clatter of pots, it felt easier to speak. "My mom," he said simply. "She had this way of turning the smallest meal into something special. When I was a kid, we didn't have much, but she made it seem like we had everything when we gathered around the table." Daniel's grin softened into something more reflective. "I know what you mean. My adoptive mom, she was the same way. Holidays were her time to shine. She'd spend days prepping, making dishes that filled the house with every scent you could imagine. It's one of the reasons I love cooking, it makes me feel close to her, even now." They worked in silence for a moment, the kitchen's noise providing a gentle soundtrack. James glanced at Daniel's hands as he rolled out dough, noticing the way his fingers drummed unconsciously, a tiny habit James himself had when he was deep in thought. "Ever wonder where you came from? Your biological family, I mean," James asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Daniel shrugged, though the casualness didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes. My mom told me a bit before she passed. She said I was left at a hospital as a baby, with nothing but a tiny blanket and an old recipe card in my pocket. Weird, right?" He chuckled, but it was hollow, tinged with a longing he didn't try to mask. James's breath caught. A recipe card? His mind raced to the box of family heirlooms tucked away in his penthouse, among them, a collection of handwritten recipe cards, each marked with the delicate script of his grandmother's handwriting. "Yeah," Daniel said, his brow furrowing as he wiped his hands on his apron. "It had some old dessert recipe on it, lemon cake or something. I don't think I ever made it, but my mom kept it as proof that someone out there had cared, even just a little." A chill ran down James's spine, conflicting with the warmth of the kitchen. He remembered that cake well. It had been a family staple, one his grandmother made on special occasions. The recipe was slightly unusual, calling for just a touch of honey and grated lemon peel, a secret touch she'd said added a bit of love. James cleared his throat, suddenly needing to keep his hands busy. He reached for another apple, slicing with a precision that masked the tremor running through his fingers. "That must have been hard, not knowing," he said, his voice quieter now. Daniel nodded, the lines around his eyes deepening. "It was. But I had a good life, you know? Still, every now and then, I wonder if I have family out there. Siblings, cousins, anyone who remembers." James felt the room shift, as if the kitchen walls had drawn closer. He searched for something to say, anything that wouldn't betray the storm of thoughts behind his calm exterior. He knew he needed more information before saying anything, but the pieces were aligning in a way that made it impossible to ignore. "You know," James said, choosing his words carefully, "we had this lemon cake in my family, too. My grandmother's recipe. She always said the secret was in the honey." Daniel's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Honey and lemon peel?" That was on the card. They stared at each other, the space between them suddenly charged. Daniel's expression shifted, curiosity mixing with disbelief. "You don't think?" "I don't know," James interrupted, heart pounding as he forced a smile. "But it's interesting, isn't it?" Daniel laughed, a shaky sound that didn't quite hide the hope creeping into his voice. "Interesting? That's one word for it. Maybe it's just a coincidence." "Maybe," James said, but the word felt empty. He could barely keep track of the memories tumbling through his mind, his father's rare mentions of an estranged brother, the whispered stories that had faded as James grew older. A voice broke through the haze, Emma, popping her head into the kitchen and waving a clipboard. "Boys, stop chatting. We need those pies in the oven, pronto." She smiled, eyes twinkling, oblivious to the shift in the room's atmosphere. "Right, back to work," Daniel said, exhaling and picking up where he left off. But his hands moved a little slower, as if he were replaying the last few minutes in his head. James forced himself to focus on the task, but the realization was beginning to take root. The idea that Daniel, the chef with the same laugh and the shared childhood quirks, could be connected to him in a way he'd never imagined, it was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The kitchen settled into a rare moment of calm as the last round of pies went into the oven, their golden crusts promising warmth and comfort. James took off his apron and wiped his hands, his eyes falling on the collection of items strewn across Daniel's workstation. Flour-dusted recipe cards, a battered whisk, and a small, tarnished locket that seemed oddly familiar. His heart thumped harder as he leaned closer, fingers brushing the delicate chain. "Hey, careful with that," Daniel said, his voice light but carrying an edge of protectiveness. He reached out, but James's gaze stayed on the locket. "Sorry, James hesitated, meeting Daniel's eyes. "This looks like one my mother had. It even has the same engraving." Daniel's brows knit together as he picked up the locket, turning it over in his fingers. The small, intricate carving on the back read "Always together," no matter where. His mouth opened, then closed, as if weighing how much to reveal. The tension coiled between them, unspoken questions hovering like steam in the warm air. "It was the only thing left with me when I was found at the hospital," Daniel finally said, his voice steady but low. "My mom said it must have come from my biological parents. I've carried it my whole life." James's chest tightened. He felt like a child again, sitting at the edge of the table while his father muttered about family secrets and old grievances. The locket's familiar engraving, paired with Daniel's story, sent memories cascading back, talks of a missing cousin, his mother's quiet sorrow during holidays, and the years when James felt like something precious had been lost. "My mother had one just like it," James said, his voice more uncertain than he intended. She always said it was a reminder of the bond she shared with her brother, my uncle, before they were separated. I never knew much more, because, well, my father wouldn't talk about it. Daniel stared at James, the guarded expression on his face slowly dissolving into realization. The kitchen noises around them seemed to blur, the bustling chatter fading as the pieces started to fall into place. I don't know if this is crazy or not, Daniel said, barely above a whisper, but I think we need to talk. Really talk. I've been searching for my biological family for years, but I never thought, his voice cracked, the weight of the possibility settling over them both. James nodded, his throat tight. After the dinner. We need to sit down and go through everything. A brief silence fell between them, only broken by the clang of a tray being set down nearby. Emma swept past, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Come on, you two, pies wait for no one, she joked, but James barely registered her voice. Agreed, Daniel said, slipping the locket into his pocket. His eyes were different now, a mixture of hope and fear. They turned back to their tasks, but both moved as if caught in a haze, glances exchanged that spoke of questions too big for now. The evening wore on, and the community dinner reached its peak. Laughter rang through the hall, clinking silverware and cheerful conversations layering over each other. But James could barely focus, his mind replaying every moment he'd spent with Daniel in the kitchen. The familiar quirks, the shared stories, and the now undeniable clue in the form of a delicate locket. When the final dishes were cleared, and the glow of the dinner began to fade, James found Daniel standing by the back entrance, coat slung over one arm. The air outside was crisp, a sharp contrast to the warmth that had filled the kitchen earlier. It seemed fitting, like a jolt to bring clarity after a day that had left them both reeling. Daniel spoke first. I don't know what I expected when I woke up this morning, but it wasn't this. His laugh was thin, more out of disbelief than humor. James nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. It's a lot. But if what we're thinking is true, it changes everything. Yeah, Daniel said, meeting James's eyes with a mix of excitement and caution. It does. They found a quiet spot in the community center's lounge, away from the bustle of volunteers cleaning up. Daniel pulled out the locket and set it on the table between them, the soft light catching on its worn edges. James couldn't look away, memories pressing in like a flood. I need to know, Daniel said, breaking the silence. I need to hear whatever stories you have. Anything that connects. James took a breath, his pulse drumming in his ears. There was always talk about my uncle, my mother's brother, leaving the family after a fight that no one ever explained. He had a son, but then, he was just gone. They lost contact, and my mother grieved him every holiday. She never knew what happened to his child, only that there was one. Daniel's eyes glistened, a tremble in his jaw. It fits. I was told my parents loved me, but couldn't keep me. That something happened, and I ended up alone. Silence fell between them, charged with the weight of recognition. James reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the locket. I think we found what we were both looking for. Daniel nodded, a slow smile forming, equal parts disbelief and wonder. Family. Neither spoke as they let the words sink in, knowing that in this moment, everything had changed. The dim glow of the community center's lounge cast long shadows across the worn leather couches and mismatched chairs. James and Daniel sat across from each other, the room hushed now that the dinner crowd had dispersed. Only the occasional clatter of dishes being cleared echoed in the distance, an oddly fitting backdrop to the conversation they were about to have. Daniel placed the locket between them, its tarnished edges glinting under the soft light. He took a deep breath, eyes searching James's face for a sign that this wasn't some surreal dream. James mirrored his tension, fingers steepled as he leaned forward. So, this locket, James said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but his eyes shimmered with emotion. It matches one my mother had when I was a kid. She used to wear it during the holidays, saying it reminded her of simpler times, of family. Daniel nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint smile. My mom, my adoptive mom, kept it close. She said it was proof that even though I was left behind, there was love somewhere in my story. I never understood what she meant, but now. James swallowed, a lump forming in his throat. Memories of his mother's wistful looks, her hand grazing the locket absently as she gazed out the window, surfaced. She had a brother, he said, voice tight. He left after a fight with my grandfather. They never spoke again. When he left, he took his son with him. No one in the family knew what happened after that. Daniel's eyes flickered with recognition, the pieces settling into place. And you think that son was you, James finished, the finality of the words settling between them. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing the gravity of this moment. They sat in silence, each man processing the truth. James ran a hand through his hair, disbelief giving way to a deep ache of regret. How many years had been wasted, filled with estrangement and solitude, while the person who could have filled that void had been out there, only a few towns away? Daniel broke the silence first, his voice cracking with emotion. I grew up not knowing where I came from. My adoptive parents were wonderful, but there was always this gap, this emptiness. Cooking, it was how I filled it. I thought if I could recreate those holiday meals, I'd feel closer to something real, something mine. James nodded, understanding washing over him. Cooking was my escape, too, he admitted. After my mother passed, my father buried himself in work, and I buried myself in recipes, in creating things that brought back some piece of her. Daniel's expression softened, the shared grief a bridge between them. It's funny, isn't it? All this time, we were both trying to feel at home, not knowing we had a piece of it within reach. James's chest tightened, the years of loneliness pressing in and then receding as if exorcised by the revelation. It's more than funny. It's heartbreaking. But maybe now, we get to rewrite that story. Daniel's eyes shone, the depth of his emotions laid bare. I'd like that, he said, voice almost a whisper. He reached for the locket, fingers trembling as he held it out. It feels like this should be yours, you know? Part of your family history. James shook his head, pushing Daniel's hand back gently. No, it's ours. Keep it. It's where it belongs now. The room, silent and still, seemed to hold the moment. The air carried a weight of unspoken understanding, the kind that only comes when wounds are recognized and accepted, not ignored. They both sat back, a deep breath shared between them, as if years of tension were exhaled at once. Daniel smiled, a tear slipping unnoticed down his cheek. I never thought cooking Thanksgiving dinners in a community center would bring me a piece of my past. Life is strange that way. James chuckled, a sound that felt warm and unfamiliar. Neither did I. It's easy to forget that not everything worth having can be planned for. He paused, eyes glistening. I'm grateful, Daniel. Not just for today, but for the reminder that there's more to life than the things I've chased. Daniel's expression softened into something bittersweet. We lost a lot of years, but we have today. And tomorrow, if we're lucky. The two men shared a quiet moment, each reflecting on the road that had brought them here. The echoes of hardship, missed opportunities, and lost time were muted by the realization that they'd been given a chance to rebuild. James reached out, clasping Daniel's shoulder, the gesture full of the promise of brotherhood renewed. The sounds of the cleanup crew sweeping and chatting in the distance were a reminder that life outside this room carried on. But here, in this small corner, a reunion was taking root, a family piecing itself back together. The warm hum of conversation filled the community hall, weaving with the clink of forks against plates and bursts of laughter. The Thanksgiving dinner had come alive with stories and shared memories, people moving between tables with easy familiarity. The glow of string lights cast soft shadows on the walls, and James found himself seated at the main table next to Daniel, a plate of turkey and mashed sweet potatoes in front of him. It was a scene James had rarely experienced, a space where success wasn't measured by profit but by connection. He watched as Daniel animatedly told a story to a group of volunteers, hands waving, eyes bright. The people around him laughed, drawn into his warmth. James felt the corners of his mouth lift into a genuine smile, something that came easier now. "I think your sweet potatoes were a hit," Emma said, sliding into the chair next to James with a playful nudge. She glanced at Daniel, who was now caught in a mock argument over the best Thanksgiving pie. "You two made quite the team in the kitchen." James chuckled, the sound deep and unforced. "It turns out we're not just related by blood but by recipes, too." He caught Emma's curious look and added, "Long story. But tonight, it's all starting to make sense." She studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "I'm glad. You seem different tonight, James." "Lighter." James's gaze drifted across the room, past the garlands and the faces of neighbors sharing food and laughter. "I feel different," he admitted. The realization was clear and sharp, the loneliness he'd worn like an armor was thinning, replaced by something fragile but hopeful. As the dinner unfolded, James found himself moving from table to table, exchanging smiles and shaking hands, listening to stories of Thanksgivings past. It was new for him, reaching out not as the untouchable entrepreneur but as someone who belonged, who shared in the moments that didn't carry price tags. The hall rang with a cheer as Daniel stood up, raising a glass. "To everyone here who makes this more than just a meal," he said, eyes twinkling as they met James's across the room. "And to finding family in the most unexpected places." James raised his own glass, the weight of Daniel's words settling in his chest. The crowd joined in, the collective gratitude echoing in the hall like a warm embrace. He took a sip, the simple act carrying a sense of belonging that he'd yearned for but hadn't known how to name. After dinner, the hall began to thin out, volunteers stacking chairs and collecting trays, but the energy remained. James stood by a window, the cool night air fogging the glass as he stared out. The city's lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the world he'd built, sterile, towering, and utterly separate from this one. Daniel approached, hands tucked into his pockets. "Hey, you look deep in thought," he said, his voice a mixture of curiosity and fondness. James sighed, turning to face his cousin. "I am. It's strange, isn't it? To realize how much you've missed, without even knowing it. I built my life on goals, deadlines, investments. But standing here, it feels empty compared to this." Daniel nodded, understanding etched into the lines of his face. "I used to wonder what it would be like to have more, to chase success. But the more I cooked for people, the more I realized that filling their plates filled something in me, too. It's not just about the food, it's about what it brings out in others." James's eyes softened. "You're right. I've spent years cooking to impress, but tonight, I felt what it's like to cook to connect. It's different. It matters." Silence settled between them, not awkward but thoughtful. They both knew that the road forward wouldn't erase the past, but it offered a chance to build on it. To shape it into something better. "Let's not waste any more time," James said, his voice firm but hopeful. "There's too much to catch up on. Too many stories left untold." Daniel smiled, wide and unguarded. "Agreed. We've got a lot of recipes to trade, too." They laughed, a sound that fit easily into the night. As the last few volunteers waved their goodbyes and Emma passed with a smile, James felt the stirrings of gratitude that went beyond words. He had come to this dinner at the urging of a friend, expecting nothing but a night's diversion. What he found instead was a piece of himself that he hadn't known was missing. "Thank you, James," Daniel said, voice lower now. "For taking the chance. For being here." James felt his eyes sting, but he didn't mind. No, Daniel. Thank you for reminding me of what truly matters. The cousins stood side by side, the hall around them filled with the echoes of an evening well spent. They didn't need more words, the promise of what was to come hung comfortably between them. Tonight had been a start, the kind of beginning that made every day after it feel like a gift. The following morning, the kitchen was quiet, sunlight trickling in through the high windows and casting long stripes across the tile floor. James sat at the table with a mug of steaming coffee in hand, a thoughtful smile on his face. The chatter of the previous night's community dinner still buzzed in his mind, leaving behind a warmth that hadn't quite faded. Daniel entered with a casual nod, holding a paper filled with scribbled notes, a mix of ideas and reminders for future events. Morning, Daniel said, eyes a little tired but bright with contentment. He set the paper down, glancing at James with a smirk. Ready for round 2, or did we wear you out last night? James chuckled, the sound deep and genuine. I'm more ready than ever, he said, placing his mug on the table. Actually, I've been thinking. Last night was more than just an evening of good food and company. It was meaningful. And it made me realize that I've been missing something in my life, something I want to help create for others. Daniel raised an eyebrow, curiosity sparking. What are you getting at? I want to fund these dinners, make them a regular event, James said, his words steady and certain. Not just for Thanksgiving, but throughout the year. Let's support local chefs, build up the community, and give people a place to feel connected. You're already doing so much here, but imagine what we could do together with more resources. Daniel blinked, stunned into silence. For a moment, the only sound was the soft ticking of a wall clock. Then a slow smile spread across his face, eyes shimmering with gratitude. James, that's incredible. Do you mean it? Every word, James said, leaning back as the room seemed to lighten. This community gave me something I didn't even know I needed. I want to give back, and I can't think of a better way than helping you build on what you've already created. Before Daniel could respond, the kitchen door opened and Emma walked in, carrying a basket of fresh produce and humming a cheerful tune. She paused when she noticed their expressions, her smile growing wider. What's going on here? You two look like you're up to something. James shot a grin in her direction. You could say that. We're making plans to expand the community dinners and support local chefs year-round. Emma's eyes widened, and for a split second, she was speechless. Then she set the basket down with a flourish and let out a triumphant laugh. Now that's what I love to hear. I knew something had changed in you, James. You have no idea what this means for so many people. Daniel nodded, still visibly moved. It's more than I could have hoped for. This isn't just about meals, it's about belonging, about creating moments that matter. James's gaze softened as he looked at both of them. Exactly. And speaking of moments that matter, I have another idea. He turned to Daniel. I'd like to invite you to my home for a private Thanksgiving celebration. Just us, a few friends, maybe some extended family if we can find them. We can start new traditions, ones that don't come with the weight of the past, but with the promise of the future. Daniel's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and emotion. I'd love that, he said, voice thick. I've spent so many holidays in kitchens like this, surrounded by wonderful people, but always wondering about family. This time it'll be different. Emma clapped her hands together. And it should be different. You two have a story that's worth sharing. Don't let it end here, use it to inspire others. Show them that no matter how much time has passed, it's never too late to reconnect, to rebuild. James met her eyes, a small nod of agreement passing between them. The thought of sharing this experience, of being more open, felt new but right. We will, Emma. Maybe we can organize more events, tell our story, and let others know they're not alone. "Count me in for that," Daniel said, his smile returning with its usual warmth. "But first, let's get through this Thanksgiving of ours. I have a feeling it's going to be one for the books." They spent the rest of the morning planning, their ideas tumbling over each other like the flow of a lively river. Emma suggested themed dinners that celebrated different cultures in the community, while Daniel excitedly mapped out workshops for local cooks. James felt a rush of anticipation. This was a new kind of ambition, one that filled him with joy instead of pressure. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted, and the three of them sat back in their chairs, surrounded by crumpled notes and the smell of roasted vegetables from the leftovers they had reheated. James looked at Daniel, a newfound lightness in his expression. "So, how do you feel about making our first official dinner next month? We could call it the giving table, or something that speaks to what this is all about." Daniel nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's perfect. A place for everyone, where they can feel the way we felt last night. Like they're part of something bigger." Emma raised her glass of iced tea and a mock toast. "To the giving table, and to what's yet to come." They clinked their glasses together, and for James, it was more than just a toast, it was a promise. A promise to choose connection over isolation, family over ambition, and to embrace every moment that life had to offer.